The Diocese of Manchester and its partners in the New Hampshire Coalition for Suicide Prevention saw a win recently when a physician-assisted suicide bill was defeated in the New Hampshire Senate. Next, we'll talk about why the diocese got involved and how this meets our obligations in the public square here on Finding Communion. Hello, welcome to Finding Communion. I'm Rosemary Ford, editor of Parable Magazine. I'm here with Bob Dunn, Director of Public Policy for the Diocese of Manchester. This podcast and the Parable column of the same name discuss the church's work in the public square and the intersection of politics and faith. Today, we're here to discuss HB 1283, a bill that would legalize physician-assisted suicide. The bill passed the New Hampshire House of Representatives, but was defeated in the Senate in a bipartisan 17-7 vote. So, Bob, this is a bill that's long been on your radar. What did it seek to do? Can you explain that to viewers?
Sure. House Bill 1283 was a bill that sought to legalize physician-assisted suicide in New Hampshire. It provided that if you had 6 months left to live and had a terminal illness, that you would be able to obtain a prescription, essentially, from a physician that you would then ingest yourself and end your own life.
Why was the diocese opposed to this?
Well, we've been speaking over the course of the last few episodes about our attention to the common good and to human dignity. And when we think about this piece of legislation in the light of those principles, it's hard to imagine a bill that could be more dangerous and pose greater peril to the people of the state. As I argued to the legislative committees, the American Red Cross gives this advice to people that are escaping from burning buildings: never open a door that is warm to the touch. And that's exactly why we thought that House Bill 1283 should be defeated.
That makes sense. Who joined the diocese in opposition to this bill? Because the diocese wasn't alone in being against this.
Far from it. We were working alongside the members of the New Hampshire Coalition for Suicide Prevention, which is an extremely broad coalition that was founded by the Brain Injury Association of New Hampshire, actually, and includes all sorts of groups that advocate on behalf of people with disabilities, veterans, young people, et cetera, et cetera. So the coalition that came along to oppose House Bill 1283 was incredibly diverse. You had the New Hampshire Hospital Association, the Disabilities Rights Center, the State Veterans Affairs Committee, and so on and so on. We had nursing home administrators that came in, high school students that came in. And the diversity of the coalition was something that, to me, illustrated the danger that the bill presented.
Can you tell me a little bit more about what your efforts entail to convince legislators that this wasn't a piece of legislation that was worth passing?
I think that the main thing that we tried to do, both as a diocese and as an overall coalition, was to make it clear that you needed to peel the onion back a little bit, that this was not something that was a question of individual autonomy, which was how it was being presented, but it was really a question of the common good, because passing a bill like this was going to have drastic impacts on people other than the ones who were seeking to end their own lives under the law. So we really tried to spend a lot of time speaking about the impacts of the bill, the unintended consequences of the bill. And we have a lot of history and experience to point to in other states where this has happened, and particularly up the road in Canada, where assisted suicide really only became the law a few years ago, but it has exploded out of control up there.
So when you were just talking now about, what's going on in other states and up the road in Canada and the dangers there, I think it's important to mention, too, that one of the reasons so many people were against this bill was because it takes an extra step to end your life when you're terminally ill. And so many people, I think, confuse that with what the church's teaching is on end-of-life issues. Can you expand on that a little bit and let people know, what does the church teach on end-of-life issues and end-of-life care?
That's a great question, because I think there are a lot of misconceptions about what the church teaches on that. The church teaches that people are not morally obligated to use extraordinary means to provide medical care at the end of life.
To prolong their life, right?
Artificially, yes. Yeah. So, for instance, a person that is 90 years old is having a heart attack. It is entirely acceptable in church teaching that person might have a DNR and not want to have an intrusive intervention that's going to be painful, complicated. It is entirely possible in the church's view that person would decide to say, I'm going to let death come naturally.
Let nature take its course.
Yes.
In DNR, just, for the record, that means do not resuscitate. And that's a common practice in hospitals and nursing homes.
Correct.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a very fact-specific sort of thing. So what is the situation for this patient in this bed on this day? Mm-hmm. And it's a very, I think, life-affirming analysis that the church undertakes or asks people to undertake. So we are certainly not involved in an assisted suicide bill in order to say that people need to approach the end of life and use all possible means up to the point of death to cling to life. Mm-hmm. That's not what the church says. The church obviously teaches that suicide is wrong, but that was not the issue here. We never go into a legislative dispute of any kind and make the argument that the legislature should or should not do something based on the fact that the Catholic Church has a certain teaching on that front. Mm-hmm. It wouldn't get us very far, I can tell you that.
I would imagine so, yeah.
What we do instead is to explain the reasons why we believe certain things. And then it's up to the legislature to make a decision about whether that is a sensible approach. Sometimes we prevail, sometimes we don't, but it's always based on the strength or the weakness of the argument that we're going to be making. I think hopefully never weakness.
That makes a lot of sense. And, I think it's worth mentioning, too, that suicide is such a problem here in New Hampshire. It's one of the leading causes of death of young people here in the state. And that's such a sad situation.
It is. And it's one of the reasons why you had high school students coming in and testifying against the bill. There was actually a press conference that happened 2 days before the Senate vote that featured high school and college students who were opposed to the legislation. Now, I think when people read a bill that talks about terminal illness and 6 months left to live, you don't think about high schoolers. Mm-hmm. But the whole point that we were trying to make to the legislature as part of the coalition was that you need to think about the consequences of passing a bill like this in all of these other areas. And I greatly appreciate the fact that these high school students stepped up to the plate because they realized the risk that a bill like this presents to people, even though it might not be apparent at first blush if you read the legislation.
Sure.
So that is, I think, one of the fundamental reasons why we oppose the bill. We have a suicide crisis in this state, and it makes zero sense, in our view, to pass a law that normalizes suicide as a medical procedure in the midst of that crisis. What sort of a message does that send?
I mean, that's a very good point. And it seems to be a successful point since the legislation indeed did not get passed.
Right.
I'm wondering what lessons you learned from this whole experience that, maybe you would carry on to, other things you do with the legislature or maybe other bills that you're going to oppose.
Well, I think it confirmed a couple of things that I've seen over the course of the 30 or so years that I've been working with the New Hampshire legislature. One of them is the importance of coalition building, of groups coming together to make arguments to the legislature when they have a common purpose. Especially in this sort of a circumstance, where you have a coalition that was incredibly diverse. It wasn't groups that would normally be together. It crossed political lines. It crossed ideological lines. But they were organizations like the veterans and like the disabilities rights advocates who wouldn't ordinarily have been together but saw the risks to the people that they represent. And so the ability to come and work together like that is really important, and it sends a strong message to the legislature about what is really going on. That's one thing. The other thing that it did for me is to confirm my faith in the New Hampshire legislature that ideology or looking at bills at first blush is not always the end of the story. That the legislature, certainly the 17 members of the Senate and the 176 members of the House that voted against the bill, were willing to look beyond the bill on its face and to think about the dangers that would be presented if a bill like that were to pass, and to think about ways of trying to provide care for people, because we shouldn't miss out on the fact that everybody involved in this, both the people who were the proponents of House Bill 1283 and the people that were the opponents of House Bill 1283, all were approaching this from the perspective of compassion. It wasn't as if the proponents of 1283 were being bloodthirsty in some way. They wanted to provide comfort to people at the end of life. And so in an odd way, every single person that was involved in this very controversial bill was coming at it for the same general reason. It's simply that we thought that their approach was an erroneous one, but it was not an approach that they were in agreement with us as to the ultimate goal of what should happen here.
Sure.
And so we would like to see hospice and palliative care advanced in New Hampshire, because that's what should happen. People who are dying should be accompanied. They should be cared for. They should have access to hospice and palliative care, and not be told that your option instead is to take this pill or this prescription that's going to end your life.
That makes a lot of sense. And, it's good to hear that both sides, in this case especially, they did have a lot of common ground, because the palliative care angle was something that both sides agreed on that needs to improve here in New Hampshire. So
one of the other interesting things about this bill is it was probably one of the most controversial bills of the legislative session. A lot of the legislators who spoke on the floor of the House and the Senate talked about the intensity of their deliberations. It was a really hard question for legislators to address and to figure out which way they needed to vote. And they were getting lots of calls from lots of different people who were very impassioned about this from both sides. But when we had the lengthy hearing days on this bill in both the House Judiciary Committee and then the Senate Health and Human Services Committee, both sides were there in force. In the House, there were probably about 100 people who testified during the course of the day, again on both sides. But it was an incredibly civil and respectful hearing process. The folks that were in the room were respectful toward each other. The folks in their remarks were respectful in what they said. And the legislators were respectful in listening to what people were saying. And I thought that that said a lot about the state of New Hampshire and how we do things, because even in the midst of this highly controversial issue, everyone on both sides of the issue could come together and rationally advance their own ideas and the way that they thought that things should turn out, and then leave it in the hands of the legislature to make the decision. So that's the sort of thing that shows that we have great hope for the future, because we can still talk about things calmly and rationally here in this state.
That's great. It's great to hear that the people were able to have those kinds of discussions in that kind of experience. So congratulations to everyone involved. This is a great result. And good luck in the future State House endeavors.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us here on Finding Communion. Please check out our show notes for more on this topic, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. We'll see you next time here on Finding Communion.